Happy belated birthday, Brian. I've been trying to get this video out for you in the last 48 hours, and something has always seemed to come up. Anyway, let's take care of this and get things square, okay? So I'm going to start by giving you an analogy, and I want you to really try to be cognizant and careful, mindfulness here, okay? Because if you understand this analogy, a lot will make sense to you, all right? When we look at classifying life, okay, our classifications are not absolute, okay? In reality, there is no such thing as a family to which a horse belongs versus primates versus squirrels, okay? But we have developed a zoological index that works. It works by using different descriptive qualities, scientifically speaking, in a way that does not always correspond to our visual recognition, okay? Bear with me on this. If you look at a lobster and a crawfish, one would think that they're very similar, okay? However, they're very distinct organisms that come from two very separate families, phylums even, okay? And as we proceed in a way of classifying, things become more specific, and we don't necessarily know scientifically all the things that contribute to making a distinction, okay? We don't know why, despite the fact that a crawfish, for all practical purposes, looks like a miniature lobster, that they are almost completely different creatures. However, if we go and show to sort of the beginning, things become a little bit less complicated and more general, okay? We do know that single-cell organisms are different than multicellular organisms, okay? There isn't really a lot of debate about that, and it's more correspondent to any sort of actuality than how we choose subsequently to organize life forms, okay? We know that in a multicellular organism, you have different types of tissues, right? Your organs are different than your skin. My fingernails that I'm pointing to, my eyes, these are all different types of tissues, whereas single cell organisms have one type of cell, okay? Now, if you understand that, okay, let's go on to our particular thing and apply the analogy, all right? In reality, we're using things to classify movement, okay? If it could be said something corresponds more to actual reality, which is a very loaded statement, so we'll say if we were to keep things relatively simple, we could start our basic movement with a description of three types of movements, okay? I was going to I'll write it, then I'll show it to you. You've got Taisabaki, okay, which is segmented movement. You've got whole body movement, moving the whole body at once. Forget I said Taisabaki, okay? We have segmented, whole body. We can move our body as a whole. We can move our feet, and we can move in different parts. Therefore, the third movement would be footwork. Okay? So far what we have, very generally, segmented movements, whole body movements, and footwork. Okay? If we take that to the next general level of descriptive quality, okay, we can talk about rotational movements, and we can talk about whole body weight drop. We'll call it weight drop, okay? Okay? Now, these are just basically the ways that we can generate force, okay? They're very basic descriptives, okay? We start with the way the body can operate and the way that it can create force, okay? You might even add shifting, okay? But that might even complicate things, but you could say that. And I'm going to tell you why. If you look at the mother Chinese art, okay, they are divided into circular, linear, and shifting. Tai Chi is about shifting, okay? Xin Yi is about weight dropping, linear progression, and Bagua is circular, okay, which could be also about rotational movement, okay? So when we talk about rotational movement, we're talking about circular movement, okay? And we now have a very basic framework without any particular designs, okay? Just like if we were to talk about single cell organisms versus multicellular organisms, all right? Now, when we start to get into the higher levels of describing these movements, okay? The thing that becomes tricky is we have correspondence when we talk about taijutsu, tai sabaki, and ashi sabaki. Okay? Took a picture of it. The thing is, these terms, even though they correspond, they have more than just the literal understanding of the more basic framework. Okay? Taijutsu is a very kind of a stylized way of segmented movement. Okay? It has to do with a lot of elements of how we're using the body primarily through segmented movement to be effective, to generate force, okay? Which implies that it has characteristics of a style, okay? And that it predominates if we use it descriptively to define any sort of movement, okay? So, for example, if I do an agash, I might refer back to rotational movement to describe that. I wouldn't call it tai sabaki, okay, because rotational movement is the primary drawing characteristic of how that works, okay? And you could also, we'll put circular in there too, okay, because rotational implies circular, okay? So that's where we're at right now. Taijutsu is the same thing. It doesn't only imply a weight shift or linear drop, it has to do with a whole way of using the body with certain characteristics in addition to just weight shifting the whole body. Okay? It's more than just a weight drop. All right. Ditto for ashi sabaki. It's footwork, but it implies there are certain characteristics that make it a little bit more stylized than just footwork. Okay? Now, with that in mind, we now have movements that we want to describe in our system and other systems. There are other ways also to describe those movements, okay? The movements can be described by a certain elemental quality, okay? So we've added to our chart the elements, okay? Like Taijutsu, Taisabaki, Ashi Sabaki, okay? The elements, wind, water, fire, earth, and void, not so much void, but we'll put it there, our secondary characteristic can be used in a multitude of ways. And one of the ways that can be used is to describe movement, okay? So, when we now transfer our attention to looking at a particular movement, let's take Aiki, okay? What we're left with is we can describe the movement on a very base level as a rotational circular movement, okay, of a sort. But we can be more specific than that, okay? A lot of the Aikijutsu involves ashi sabaki, okay, your footwork to some degree. But even more prominent is that it's a wind movement, okay? It's a movement that is characterized by the wind sort of understanding of a circular movement, okay? See how we've colored our description now? Wind movement is circular. It involves these big circular movements usually, as opposed to if we're describing something primarily as a rotational movement, where, okay, it's more about the force of using one part of the body as an axis and another part as a turret, okay, using something to rotate from. Whereas Aikijutsu is much more about using the entire body, okay, in a circular movement, which, again, could you call it taijutsu because it's whole body movement? No, it doesn't work. And that's exactly why we use different descriptors and we have choices to draw from, okay? Now, when you are making a choice and trying to define that your movements, okay, you want to use those which are primary, which best describe. And it's really as simple as that. We have other descriptors as well. We can talk about the quality of a movement, okay? Let's talk about the qualities, those things external, okay? These can be explosive, they can be with bone, sinew, as opposed to muscle, okay? They can be strong, muscular. Okay, so now, if you look, we're adding qualities. Qualities are not movements themselves. They are different characteristics of how the movement is achieved and attained. You can be explosive. Okay, you can use your bone, your sinews, okay, your skeletal structure. You can use your musculature. Now, You can come up with more qualities, perhaps. But the important thing here is you now have a whole thing. And I'll point once more and a whole chart. A very clear distinction in how things are described. And you need these things because there is confusion in that some of the terms that we employ come from styles. Therefore, they have already characteristics that make them particular. All right? Taijutsu is not just whole body movement, it is a particular way of using the body to generate force. Okay? Which has a lot to do with water movement, okay? Shifting the weight, dropping the weight, okay? So think of these as different toolbox terms to apply to your understanding of the movement. None of them are absolute. Some of them are more closer to absolute than others, okay? And that's about the best way I can think of to describe it. I hope that helps.